The nurse sings to Coma patient every night for a year, unaware he could hear everything she said. This routine, born first from professional duty and later personal devotion, had become the only constant in both their fractured lives. Emma Lawrence straightened her scrubs as she made her final rounds, the hallway's fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead like distant summer insects. In 3 minutes, she would enter room 418, as she had every night since they'd brought him in. The hospital had a rhythm of its own after dark. The daytime bustle gave way to something more intimate, a hush punctuated by the soft beeps of monitoring equipment, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes, and occasional whispered conversations. Emma preferred these night shifts. They allowed space for the quiet compassion that had drawn her to nursing before burnout had nearly stolen it away. She paused outside room 418, gathering herself as she always did. The small whiteboard beside the door still read, Michael Sullivan, in her own handwriting, though the date beside it had been changed countless times. 357 days, to be exact. Almost a full year since the accident that had delivered him, broken and silent, to this room. Inside, monitors cast a blue-green glow over the still form in the bed. Michael Sullivan, 34 years old, lay motionless as he had since the February night, when a patch of black ice had sent his car spinning off the road and into a ravine. The medical chart listed his injuries clinically: severe traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. What it couldn't capture was the absence, the person who had vanished while the body remained. "Good evening, Michael," Emma said softly, settling her weight on the chair beside his bed. Her words fell into what the doctors called a void, a consciousness so deeply retreated that no stimuli could reach it. "Glasgow Coma Scale still at 5, she noted in her chart, her pen scratching quietly against paper. But Michael Sullivan heard her. Inside the prison of his unresponsive body, he registered her voice like a beacon cutting through endless fog. He'd been hearing everything for months, fragments at first, disembodied voices floating through darkness, then gradually more coherent as his brain slowly, infinitesimally, began to heal. But no one knew. His body betrayed nothing of the desperate awareness trapped inside. "Rain tonight?" Emma said conversationally as she checked his IV line, the kind that makes you want to curl up with a good book. She worked methodically, adjusting his position slightly to prevent bed sores, moistening his lips with a sponge. Michael felt her gentle touch like salvation. In his darkness, human contact was everything. The brief pressure of fingers checking his pulse, the careful movements as she tended to his body. Each touch affirmed he was still here, still connected to a world he could no longer reach. Tonight, as every night for the past 8 months, Emma would sing to him. It had begun impulsively one evening when the sadness of his situation had overwhelmed her. A simple lullaby her grandmother had sung to her as a child had spilled from her lips before she'd even realized it. Now it was their ritual, one she believed was for her benefit alone. "Your sister called the unit again today," Emma said, settling back in her chair. "She wanted to know if there's been any change. I told her what the doctors said, but I don't know, Michael. Sometimes I think they're wrong about people like you." Inside his stillness, Michael strained toward her voice. His sister Diana's visits had grown less frequent as months passed, understandably so. She had 2 young children, a demanding job, a life that couldn't pause indefinitely while he lingered here. The guilt of feeling relieved when she didn't come twisted through him. Her crying made everything harder. Emma began to hum softly, the melody finding its rhythm as her day's tensions began to unwind. This moment, just the 2 of them in the blue-tinged darkness, had become something sacred to her, though she'd never admitted it to anyone. "You know, I wasn't supposed to be your nurse," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I was planning to leave St. Mercy's altogether around the time you arrived. 3 years of the ICU had hollowed me out. I'd given my notice and everything." Her fingers lightly traced the edge of his blanket, smoothing an invisible wrinkle. "Then they wheeled you in? Something about your case. I don't know. I asked to postpone my departure. Just for a while, I told myself." A year later, she was still here. Emma had never told Michael her whole story during these nighttime confessionals. How nursing had been her salvation after her fiancé's death 5 years ago. How the structure of caring for others had kept her upright when grief threatened to collapse her entirely. Or how gradually the giving had depleted her until she'd had nothing left. Until him. "I think it's a Billy Joel night," she declared softly, reaching for the water cup on his bedside table to take a sip. "Don't worry, I'll spare you my rendition of Piano Man." A small laugh escaped her, the kind that acknowledged its own sadness. When she began to sing "And So It Goes," her voice was clear and unembellished. Emma didn't consider herself particularly talented, but in this room, for this audience, it didn't matter. The melody rose and fell like gentle waves, filling the sterile space with something warm and human. Inside his darkness, Michael clung to every note. Emma's singing had become his calendar, his clock, his window to a world beyond beeping machines and medical procedures. He knew her voice in all its variations. When she was tired, her singing took on a slightly raspy quality. When she'd had a good day, notes came more freely, with small improvisations. Tonight he detected a thread of melancholy woven through the lyrics. What Emma couldn't know was how her voice created color in his mind, cool blues and purples swirling through the darkness. How the music temporarily silenced the panic that still gripped him during his most conscious moments. How her singing had, quite literally, kept him sane. "The nurses on day shift think I'm crazy," Emma confided after finishing the song. "Singing to someone who can't hear me. Talking like you're listening." She adjusted his blanket again, her fingertips briefly brushing against his hand. "Maybe I am a little crazy. But everyone needs someone to talk to, right? Even if they can't answer back." If only she knew how desperately he was trying to answer. How many times he had screamed replies in his mind, had focused every remaining fragment of his will on moving a finger, blinking an eye, anything to signal he was here. The medical literature called it locked-in syndrome, this hellish awareness without ability to communicate. The doctors had considered the possibility early on, had run tests, but his brain activity hadn't provided the evidence they needed, so they'd concluded he was simply gone, a body without consciousness, and adjusted their prognosis accordingly. "I had that dream again last night," Emma said, her voice dropping lower as she moved from singing to confession. "The one where I'm swimming in deep water and I can see someone below me sinking. I keep diving down, but the water gets darker, and I can never quite reach them." She paused. "I always wake up with my heart racing, feeling like I've failed somehow." Michael knew about failure. Before the accident, he'd been drowning in it. A once promising architect whose small firm had collapsed during the recession, whose engagement had ended painfully, who'd been driving too fast on an icy night because the walls of his empty apartment had been closing in. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He'd finally found someone who truly saw him, who spoke to him as if he mattered, and he couldn't even thank her. Emma glanced at her watch. 20 minutes had passed, all she could really spare from her rounds, though she often stretched it when the floor was quiet. "One more before I go?" she said, and began to sing Blackbird. Her voice caught slightly on "Into the Light of the Dark Black Night," and Michael wished with everything in him that he could reach out and take her hand. When she finished, she sat in silence for a moment, then gently squeezed his shoulder. "Sleep well, Michael. I'll see you tomorrow." After she left, the room felt emptier than the vacuum of space. Michael focused on the lingering scent of her shampoo, something with lavender, and replayed her songs in his mind, a technique he'd developed to combat the crushing solitude between her visits. He measured his existence in the spaces between Emma's appearances, surviving one moment to the next, until her voice would again anchor him to humanity. The days passed in an endless blur for Michael, punctuated only by Emma's nightly visits. Doctors came and went. Physical therapists moved his limbs to prevent atrophy. Occasionally, Diana would visit, sometimes bringing her children, who spoke to him in uncertain voices, clearly coached by their mother. "Uncle Mike, we miss you. Mom says you can hear us even if you can't say anything back." If only the doctors believed the same. Spring turned to summer, bringing the scent of cut grass through his occasionally opened window and the sound of distant lawnmowers. Emma would sometimes describe the weather, painting pictures with her words that became Michael's only window to the outside world. "The sky was incredible today," she told him one July evening. "One of those summer thunderstorms rolled through around noon. You should have seen the clouds, Michael. All dark blue and purple, with the sun breaking through in places. Made everything look like one of those Renaissance paintings with divine light streaming down." Her descriptions became his eyes. Through her, he experienced the changing seasons, the hospital gossip, the small daily triumphs and frustrations that constituted a normal life, the life he desperately missed. As autumn approached, Emma's visits took on a new dimension. She began bringing books, reading aloud for 10 or 15 minutes each night. "My grandmother used to say that stories are medicine," She explained the first night she pulled a paperback from her bag. And medicine is what we do here, right? She chose carefully, nothing too complex or demanding, short stories mostly, or chapters from novels with hopeful themes. Tonight it was a Ray Bradbury story about summer that made Michael ache with longing for the feel of grass beneath his feet, for the simple pleasure of moving his own body through space. "I've been thinking about going back to school," Emma said after finishing the story, closing the book with a soft thump. "For my nurse practitioner license. I've been putting it off for years, telling myself I don't have the energy, the time, the money." She sighed. "The truth is, I've been afraid to want things again. After Daniel died, it seemed safer to just exist." Michael had pieced together fragments of Emma's story over the months. Daniel, her fiancé, killed in a climbing accident 5 years ago. The grief that had nearly destroyed her. The slow, painful rebuilding of a life. "But something's changed," she continued, her voice taking on a quality he hadn't heard before, something like cautious hope. "I found the application forms online last night. Just looking, I told myself, but I filled them out, all the way to the end." If Michael could have smiled, he would have. This woman who sang to an unresponsive patient every night deserved every dream she could imagine, and more. In his darkness, he cheered for her silently, willing her to embrace this new direction. "Anyway," she said, seeming almost embarrassed by her disclosure, "enough about my existential crisis. You didn't ask for my life story." She laughed softly. "Though I suppose that's one advantage of your situation. You're a very patient listener." Her hand briefly touched his, and as always, the contact sent a jolt of awareness through him, the only real sensation in his sensory-deprived existence. "Time for your song," she said, and began to sing "Bridge Over Troubled Water." Her voice was particularly clear tonight, and Michael wondered if her decision about school had lightened something within her. When she reached the line, "I will lay me down," Michael felt something extraordinary, a tightening in his throat, a pressure behind his eyes. If he could have wept, he would have, not from sadness but from the pure emotional resonance of her voice, carrying those words to him across the abyss of his condition. What happened next would forever alter both their lives. As Emma sang the final notes, her hand resting lightly on the bed near his, Michael's index finger moved. Just a millimeter, a twitch so slight it would have been imperceptible if Emma hadn't been looking directly at his hand at that exact moment. She stopped mid-note, her breath catching. "Michael?" Inside his prison, Michael was screaming, "Move again! Move!" But his body, having granted that infinitesimal miracle, refused further commands. Emma pressed the call button, her heart thundering. When the night resident arrived, she explained what she'd seen, her words tumbling over each other in excitement. Dr. Reeves regarded her with the gentle skepticism reserved for emotional nurses. "Spontaneous reflexes are common in coma patients, Emma. It doesn't necessarily indicate consciousness." "This wasn't a reflex," Emma insisted. "It was responsive. It happened exactly at the emotional peak of the song." "You've been caring for him a long time," Dr. Reeves said kindly. "It's natural to hope for signs of improvement, but we need to be realistic about Mr. Sullivan's condition." Emma bit back her frustration. "Will you at least note it in his chart? And maybe order an EEG?" "I'll make a note," he conceded, "but I don't want to give his family false hope based on what was likely an involuntary movement." After he left, Emma returned to Michael's side, her face close to his. "I saw that," she whispered fiercely. "I know what I saw. If you can hear me, if you're in there, I'm not giving up." Michael would have wept with gratitude if his body had permitted it. Someone believed. Finally, someone believed. The next night, Emma arrived earlier than usual, carrying a small digital recorder. "Hope you don't mind," she said, placing it on the bedside table. "If anything happens, I want evidence." She spoke with new intensity, leaning closer than usual. "Michael, if you can hear me, if you're conscious in there, we need to establish a pattern. 1 finger movement for yes, 2 for no. We'll start simple." For the next hour, Emma asked questions, sang, read passages with emotional impact, anything that might trigger a response. Michael strained against the leaden weight of his own body, focusing every fragment of his will on moving that single finger again. Nothing happened. By the end of her shift, Emma's initial excitement had dimmed, though her determination hadn't. "It's okay," she told him, packing up the recorder. "Rome wasn't built in a day. We'll try again tomorrow." And they did. Night after night, Emma devised new approaches, different songs, emotional stories, even playing recordings of his sister's voice. Sometimes she would simply sit in silence, holding his hand, willing him to squeeze back. 2 weeks passed without another movement. Dr. Reeves grew concerned about Emma's intensity, gently suggesting she might be becoming too emotionally invested. The nursing director had noticed her spending extra time in room 418 and reminded her about professional boundaries. "They think I'm losing it," Emma confided to Michael one night, her voice tight with frustration. "Maybe I am. Maybe I imagined it." She sighed heavily. "But I know what I saw." Inside his darkness, Michael's desperation mounted. The moment when his finger had moved remained a mystery even to him. He couldn't recreate whatever neural pathway had briefly opened. Each failed attempt crushed him further. What if that single movement was all he would ever manage? What if he remained trapped forever, with Emma eventually giving up, moving on? That night, Emma sang Hallelujah, Leonard Cohen's lyrics flowing through the quiet room like a prayer. When she reached the final chorus, her voice breaking slightly on, "It's a cold and broken hallelujah," Michael felt something shift inside him, not physically, but as if some internal wall had crumbled. And suddenly, there were tears. Actual tears, sliding from the corners of his eyes. Emma gasped mid-note, leaning forward to look more closely. "Michael? Oh my God, you're crying!" She pressed the call button repeatedly, then took his face between her hands. "I knew it," she whispered fiercely. "I knew you were in there." Dr. Chen, the night neurologist who responded to the call, was less dismissive than Dr. Reeves had been. "Lacrimation can occur for physiological reasons," she cautioned, "but the timing you describe is interesting." She performed a quick examination, paying special attention to Michael's pupillary responses. "I'd like to schedule a functional MRI," she said finally. "There are newer protocols specifically designed to detect consciousness in seemingly unresponsive patients." Hope surged through Michael so powerfully, he thought it might physically lift him from the bed. Someone was listening. Someone was taking Emma seriously. "I'll arrange it for tomorrow morning," Dr. Chen continued. "And Emma? Good catch. Sometimes the people who spend the most time with patients notice things we miss during our brief examinations." After the doctor left, Emma sat beside Michael's bed, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Did you hear that? We're going to prove you're in there." She took his hand between both of hers. "I always knew somehow. Not consciously maybe, but something kept drawing me back here, night after night." The fMRI was scheduled for 10 a.m. Emma, though off-duty, returned to the hospital to accompany Michael to the procedure. She walked alongside as they wheeled his bed through the corridors, talking constantly, reassuring him about what would happen. "They're going to ask you to think about specific things while they watch which areas of your brain activate," she explained. "It's not painful, just a bit noisy. I'll be right outside the whole time." The test lasted nearly 2 hours. Inside the massive machine, Michael concentrated with every fiber of his being on the tasks they gave him through headphones. Imagine walking through your house. Imagine playing tennis. Think yes or no in response to simple questions. Afterward, he was returned to his room to wait for results. Emma stayed, though she'd been awake for over 24 hours. She dozed in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting near his on the blanket. Late that afternoon, Dr. Chen returned with Dr. Patel, the head of neurology. Their expressions gave nothing away as they asked Emma to step into the hallway briefly. Michael's anxiety spiked, the monitors beside him registering the increase in his heart rate. When they returned, Emma's face was transformed by a radiant smile. She rushed to his side while the doctors explained their findings more formally. "Mr. Sullivan?" Dr. Patel began, addressing him directly for the first time in a year. "The functional MRI shows clear evidence of consciousness. You're demonstrating organized brain activity consistent with awareness and comprehension. In simpler terms, you can hear and understand us even though you cannot respond physically." Michael would have sobbed with relief if he could control his breathing. They knew. After a year of screaming into the void, someone finally heard him. "We'll be implementing a comprehensive reassessment and new treatment plan," Dr. Chen added. "There are specialized rehabilitation centers that work specifically with patients in your condition, and there are communication systems, eye-tracking technology for instance, that might allow you to express yourself while we work on recovering motor function." Emma's hand found his, squeezing gently. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. "Not that you ever were, but now everyone else knows it too." The days that followed brought dizzying changes. Michael's sister Diana arrived, tearful and hopeful by turns, apologizing repeatedly for the times she'd spoken around him rather than to him. A parade of specialists evaluated him. Plans were made for transfer to a rehabilitation facility in Chicago that specialized in disorders of consciousness. Through it all, Emma remained his constant. Though her role was technically diminished now that other specialists had taken over his care, she still came every night, still sang, still talked to him. But now she asked questions, leaving pauses for answers she knew he was forming in his mind, even if he couldn't yet express them. "I submitted my application," she told him one evening, about a week after the fMRI, "for nurse practitioner school. I keep thinking about what you taught me. How presence matters, how we never really know what's happening inside someone else's experience." Michael wished desperately that he could tell her how much she had saved him, how her voice had been the thread he followed through the darkest labyrinth imaginable. The night before his scheduled transfer, Emma came to his room with a small gift bag. "I brought you something," she said, seeming uncharacteristically nervous. "For your new room in Chicago." She pulled out a digital music player and headphones. "I recorded some songs for you, just me, singing the ones you seem to respond to most. I thought you might want something familiar while you're adjusting to the new place." The gesture nearly broke him. This woman, who had no obligation to him beyond professional duty, who had fought for him when everyone else had given up, was ensuring he wouldn't lose the one thing that had kept him tethered to sanity. "I'm also giving you my email address and phone number," she continued. "Once they get you set up with the eye tracking system, maybe you can, I don't know, maybe you'd want to stay in touch? Let me know how you're doing." Inside his stillness, Michael was screaming yes, pleading with her to know how desperately he wanted that connection to continue. As if she heard him, Emma smiled softly. "I'll take that as a yes." She placed the music player on his bedside table. "One last song before I go?" she sang, "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," her clear voice filling the room that had been his entire world for a year. When she finished, she leaned down and, very gently, pressed her lips to his forehead. "Goodbye, Michael Sullivan," she whispered. "Go find your rainbow." 3 months later, Emma received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read simply, "Thank you for singing me back to life." Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Emma, this is being typed by a therapy assistant as I select letters using eye movements, so forgive any errors. They tell me I'll eventually graduate to a system I can use independently. I don't know where to begin. How do you thank someone for being your lifeline when you were drowning in darkness? How do you explain what it means to hear a voice when you're lost inside yourself? Every night for a year, you gave me something to live for. Your songs became my calendar, my clock, my connection to the world. Your voice created colors in my mind when I had nothing else to see. I heard everything, Emma. Everything. Your stories about your day, your confessions about Daniel, your doubts and hopes and dreams. I heard you decide to apply to school, heard the change in your voice when you found your direction again. I cheered for you silently, wishing I could tell you how much you deserved every good thing. The doctors here say my prognosis is better than they initially thought. The brain is mysterious that way. They're seeing small improvements in my motor function, nothing dramatic, but enough to give hope. Yesterday, I managed to blink voluntarily for the first time. A small victory, but mine. I listen to your recordings every night. The nurses here think it's sweet, the singing nurse who believed in the coma patient when no one else did. They don't understand that it's so much more than that. You once told me that everyone needs someone to talk to, even if they can't answer back. Now I can answer, you saved me, Emma Lawrence. Not just my awareness, but my humanity. When medicine had written me off, you pulled me back from the edge with nothing but your voice and your kindness. I don't know what happens next. Recovery will be slow if it comes at all. But whatever future I have, you gave it to me. And if that future could somehow include you, as a friend, as a correspondent, as anything you're willing to be, it would mean everything. With deepest gratitude, Michael. Emma read the email 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she reached for her phone and began composing a reply, her fingers flying across the screen. Dear Michael, I just received your email, and I can barely see to type through my tears. Good tears, the kind that come when something breaks open inside you and lets the light in. Of course I want to stay connected. Of course I want to be part of whatever comes next for you. The year I spent singing to you changed me too, in ways I'm still discovering. I have so much to tell you, about school, I got accepted, about the patients who have touched my life since you, about how I sing now to all my patients because of you. But mostly I want to say this. What looked like me saving you was actually you saving me right back. Before you, I was going through the motions of living. You reminded me what it means to truly see another person, to connect beyond words. I'll visit as soon as you're ready for visitors. Until then, I'll write. Every day if you want. This isn't an ending, Michael. It's a beginning. With hope, Emma. She sent the message, then sat quietly for a long moment, feeling something unfamiliar expanding in her chest, something that felt remarkably like joy. Outside her apartment window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Somewhere over the rainbow indeed. 6 months later, Emma stood in the doorway of a sunlit room in the rehabilitation center, watching as a therapist guided Michael through exercises designed to strengthen his gradually awakening muscles. His progress had been slow but steady. He could now move his right hand intentionally, could form simple words with his mouth, though speaking remained difficult. Their relationship had evolved through emails, video calls, and now, finally, in-person visits whenever Emma could make the 3-hour drive to Chicago. What had begun as a one-sided connection had developed into something deeper, a friendship forged in extraordinary circumstances, growing towards something neither of them had expected to find again. Michael looked up and saw her, his face lighting with a smile that still pulled slightly unevenly, but contained all the warmth in the world. The therapist helped position him in his wheelchair, and Emma crossed the room to take his partially responsive hand in hers. "I brought my guitar this time," she said, gesturing to the case slung over her shoulder. "Thought maybe we could try a duet. The music therapist says you've been working on humming." Michael's eyes, now fully expressive where once they had been vacant, filled with a happiness so tangible it seemed to brighten the entire room. He squeezed her hand, a new skill, hard-won through countless hours of therapy, and formed a single word with deliberate care: sing. And so she did, her voice joining with his halting but determined humming, creating a harmony that bridged past and future, silence and sound, isolation and connection. Two people who had pulled each other from darkness, now stepping together into whatever light awaited them.